Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to the second installment of my Chronicles of Narnia series. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you haven't seen the first video where we go through the Magician's Nephew, I recommend you to check that out first, but it isn't really mandatory to be able to follow along in the story. And still, I will link it above and below for you to indulge at your leisure. Now, in case you didn't know, the second story in the series was actually written first. So if you're just coming from The Magician's Nephew and this is your first introduction to the story, this could be useful to know. But I don't want to spoil anything before we go through the story, so without further ado, why don't you make yourself comfortable with a nice hot cup of tea or any other beverage of your choice, and let's get into it. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Chapter 1. Meet the Pevensies. Gone are the days of the romanticized Victorian era, and we are now in 1940s London being terrorized by the air raids of the Nazis. And it was because of these air raids that many children were sent out to safety in the countryside. Among them were 4 siblings, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy Pevensey. And they were sent to a grand country house to live with an old professor until it was safe to return home. Once they arrived, they were excited about the possibilities of exploring the landscape, like any child would. But sadly, the pouring rain forced them to stay inside. Trying to make the best of the situation, they had to make do with exploring indoors, just like 2 other children we know from several decades earlier. They went through many rooms, finding extra bedrooms, galleries, and even a suit of armor, until they found one spare room, which was probably the most insignificant of them all. It contained nothing but a big wardrobe and a dead flower on the windowsill. So Peter, Susan, and Edmund deemed it uninteresting and left, but Lucy, the youngest, stayed behind. She opened the wardrobe and found several fur coats hanging there, and she stepped inside to feel the soft fur on her skin. But after a couple of steps, Lucy noticed that she couldn't feel the back of the wardrobe. Instead, it was as though it kept going, like a dark tunnel with rows and rows of fur coats. Keeping the door open, as she knew it was a foolish thing to shut oneself inside a wardrobe, she continued down the dark tunnel until she found something all the more curious. There was a light a bit further away, along with something cold and crunchy beneath her feet. Then the soft furs were replaced by something prickly, and suddenly she realized that she was standing in the middle of a snowy forest at nighttime. She continued walking towards the light in the distance, and soon enough she found that it was a lamppost. A curious thing to find in the middle of a forest, isn't it? But the surprises didn't end there. A figure soon emerged from among the trees, carrying an umbrella and some parcels. He had the upper body of a man and the lower body of a goat. It was a faun, but despite the horns, the tail, and the goat hoofs, he had a pleasant face. The moment he saw Lucy, he dropped his parcels in surprise and exclaimed, "Goodness gracious me!" Lucy greeted him, but he went on to ask whether she was a daughter of Eve, or rather a human girl. Lucy confirmed this, thinking that it was rather obvious, but the faun said that he had never met a human before and seemed very excited. He introduced himself as Tumnus and asked how Lucy had come to Narnia. She said that she came from the wardrobe in the spare room, but as that didn't make any sense to either of them, the faun, Mr. Tumnus, asked her over for tea instead. Chapter 2. The Faun and the White Lady. Mr. Tumnus lived in a kind of cave, reminding somewhat of a hobbit hole in its description. Once there, they had sardines and toast and cake, and once they had eaten, Mr. Tumnus began playing his flute. Lucy urged that she had to go back home, as the others would surely worry about her. But then Mr. Tumnus started crying, saying that he was a bad faun. He had been given orders by the White Witch, the very one that had cursed Narnia into an everlasting winter, that if he was ever to find a human in the forest, he had to bring them to her. And that's what he had initially planned on doing to Lucy, but he felt so guilty that he just became sad instead. So eventually he decided to go against the witch's orders and agreed to let Lucy go. So they hurried through the dark, snowy forest in silence until they reached the lamppost. They bid each other farewell, and Lucy went back the same way she had come until she was back among the fur coats and exited through the wardrobe door. She could hear her siblings' voices down the passage, so she ran to them, saying that she was all right, she was back now. But they had no idea what she was talking about. They had all just left that room, and she was right behind them when they did. So she then went on to tell them that there was a whole other country through that wardrobe called Narnia, and there was a witch and a faun there. She ran back to the wardrobe to show them, and they followed. But as she opened it, it was now clearly just a wardrobe. Even the back of it was visible. There was obviously no portal to another country there. So for the following days, Lucy was miserable as her siblings teased her about this made-up country she went on about, and the second youngest sibling, Edmund, was particularly mean. Now, a few days later, they were all playing hide and seek, and Lucy wanted to investigate the wardrobe again because by this point, she was beginning to wonder whether her visit to Narnia had all just been a dream. So she went to the spare room and entered the wardrobe, and just as she disappeared into its hidden depth, Edmund came into the room. He saw where she had gone and decided to follow her, thinking that if they could both hide in the wardrobe, he could continue to tease her about her crazy story. He then went into the wardrobe, but to his surprise, he couldn't find Lucy. He searched through the darkness with his arms out, but instead of bumping into his little sister, or the back of the wardrobe, he emerged in a snowy forest next to a lamppost. Realizing that Lucy's story had been true all along, he called out for her, even apologizing, but there was no answer. Just as he thought she was hiding from him out of spite, something a lot bigger than his sister appeared. It was a sledge drawn by 2 reindeer, driven by a dwarf with a very long beard. It had only one passenger, a lady dressed in white furs with a crown on her head and a wand in her hand. The sledge stopped at her command, and she addressed Edmund, asking him whether he was a human. He confirmed this, which led to the lady inviting him to sit in her sledge to warm up. She conjured up a hot drink for him, as well as any food of his choice. So he asked for Turkish delight. The number of times Turkish delight will be mentioned in this book is astonishing. This might not sound so special on its own, but you see, it was enchanted, making Edmund incapable of resisting it. With these bribes offered up, she began asking him some questions, leading him to tell her about his siblings, Peter, Susan, and Lucy. Especially the fact that Lucy had already been to Narnia and met the faun. She made him promise to bring back his siblings to Narnia and take them to her home, which she pointed the direction of in the distance. And if he followed through with this request, she would give him more Turkish delight than he could eat, make him a prince, and heir to her kingdom. Then she left him there in the snow, and just as her sledge disappeared, Lucy showed up. She was quite happy to see him, saying that she had just had lunch with Mr. Tumnus, and everything was quite well, as the White Witch hadn't found out about him letting her go and such. And she told him more about the White Witch, who called herself a queen, and thus making Edmund increasingly uncomfortable as he realized who his new friend was. But he kept this a secret from Lucy, still being under the enchantment of the magical Turkish delight. He was also not a fan of the idea of admitting to Peter and Susan that Lucy had been right all along. Typical brother behavior, to be fair. Chapter 3. Beavers and Prophecies. Edmund and Lucy then returned through the wardrobe and swiftly went to find the others. While Edmund hadn't been sure of what to do, he made a split-second decision as soon as Lucy told Peter and Susan that Narnia was real and now Edmund had been there too. So he flat out denied it, saying that he had indulged her for a bit, but it was really all made up. This made Lucy very upset and she rushed off to cry. My neighbor is out on his balcony and he is staring right at me and I cannot close the curtains because then I'm losing out on natural light. I'm taking one for the team. Oh, that's embarrassing. After this, Peter and Susie began... Susie? After this, Peter and Susan began to worry about Lucy. She clearly wasn't well, so they decided to go to the professor, meaning the owner of the house, to ask his advice. Now, the professor was kind of a no-nonsense character. He mainly asked whether Lucy was usually untruthful, to which they replied no. So he made the assumption that she was likely telling the truth. And then he told them to mind their own business. So Peter and Susan let it go and stopped being so hard on Lucy, and the subject of the hidden world of Narnia was entirely dropped. One day, the siblings found themselves in a tight spot. The housekeeper, Mrs. McCready, was showing the house to a group of visitors, and they had been told to keep out of the way whenever this happened. So they ran about trying desperately to find a place to hide, when, coincidentally, the only available spot was the wardrobe in the spare room. Into it they went and waited, or at least had planned to, but they were quickly distracted by the cold wetness around them. And no wonder, it was snow, and thus Peter and Susan saw for themselves that there was, in fact, a snowy forest inside the wardrobe. So they apologized to Lucy and agreed to go exploring, but immediately Edmund put his foot in his mouth. He tried to steer them more in the direction of the lamppost, most likely because he knew the direction to the witch's castle from there, but by extension he admitted to having been there before and lied about its existence. So they were all pretty upset with Edmund, and he had to follow them instead as they went to visit Mr. Tumnus. But as they arrived at his house, they found that it had been trashed, and a note was conveniently left behind saying that he had been arrested for high treason against Her Imperial Majesty Queen Jadis, as he had been consorting with humans. But then a robin showed at the scene, and the children followed it for a while as it flew from tree to tree, as if guiding them somewhere. When it finally left them, some 30 minutes later, another creature appeared that was even more curious. It was a beaver, and it spoke to them, which they didn't seem surprised about at all, oddly enough. The beaver said that Tumnus had asked him to meet up with them should they come back. He also told them that there had been rumors that Aslan was on the move and had perhaps already arrived. The children knew nothing of Aslan, of course, but they all experienced strange sensations within them as they heard his name. So they followed the beaver for another hour until they reached his home. The beaver and his wife, Mrs. Beaver, lived in a little hut by the river, and there they treated the children to a dinner of freshly caught trout, boiled potatoes, and butter. I love reading about food in books, but I always get hungry doing it. Am I alone in this? Well, regardless, after dinner, Mr. Beaver told them that Tumnus had been taken to the White Witch, where he will likely have been turned to stone to stand with the other statues in her courtyard. Lucy was beside herself with guilt, knowing that it was all her fault. Mr. Beaver continued, saying that hope was rekindled now since Aslan had called to a meeting the following day, and Mr. Beaver will take them there. Meeting up with Aslan would surely be the best possible way to help Mr. Tumnus and everyone else taken by the White Witch. He also told them of a prophecy that there are 4 thrones in the castle that the White Witch called her home, and the prophecy says that 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve were meant to sit on those thrones. That's why the White Witch would want to do anything in her power to stop the prophecy from coming true. This was when they realized something. There weren't 4 of them anymore. Edmund was missing. They went outside to look for him, but it was no use. The snow was knee-deep and kept falling, and there was no sign of him. Mr. Beaver then said that he had known the moment he saw Edmund that he had treachery in his eyes, as he had the enchanted look of someone who had met the White Witch and eaten her food. He would have likely left to get back to her as soon as he could. Well, good thing Mr. Beaver didn't see the need to keep an eye on Edmund or anything. There was no time to waste. Not knowing exactly how much of their plans Edmund had heard, and could thus forward to the White Witch, they had no choice but to leave the Beavers' home immediately. Chapter 4: Christmas Presents. Meanwhile, Edmund had a good long hike in the snow to get to the witch's castle. He had heard enough of their plan to meet up Aslan, but had left just before they mentioned the prophecy of the 4 thrones. Not that it mattered much anyway, as Edmund carried a lot of resentment against his siblings. He had a stereotypical middle child syndrome, one could say. So the idea of being the White Witch's chosen heir would have been far more appealing to him at that moment than to share power with his brother and sisters. As Edmund arrived at the witch's castle, he crossed the courtyard full of statues, creatures she had turned to stone, and he announced himself to a wolf that guarded the door, telling him that he was the boy that Her Majesty had met the other day, and that he had returned to Narnia with his siblings, as she had requested. He followed the wolf as he led him to the witch, and saw a statue on the way of a sad-looking faun. He had a passing thought that that might be Lucy's friend, but that was the extent of his sympathy. He then approached the White Witch joyfully, but she immediately scolded him for coming alone. Where were his siblings? He was told to bring them. Edmund stammered that they were over at the Beavers, and he also told her of their plans to meet up with Aslan. This was shocking news to her, and she immediately ordered her sledge to be made ready. Now, back at the Beavers, they had packed some food, got their fur coats, and set off into the darkness. Lucy, Peter, and Susan followed the Beavers for hours and hours until they were all quite exhausted. They then rested for the night in a hidden cave and woke up not only to a bright, crisp morning, but to the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver went outside to look, and soon enough he called the others outside. A sledge had arrived, drawn by reindeer, but it wasn't the White Witch. It was Father Christmas, or Santa Claus if you prefer, and he had gifts for all of them. Peter received a sword and a shield, Susan got a bow and a quiver full of arrows, as well as a small ivory horn. The bow was said to be enchanted to rarely miss, and the horn would get her help whenever she used it. As for Lucy, he gave her a small glass bottle containing a magical flower juice that could heal any injury. And she was also given a dagger in case she ever needed to defend herself. But he made it clear that neither Susie... Why do I always say Susie? Neither Susan nor Lucy was to go into battle. Lucy asked why, saying that she thinks she'd be brave enough to fight. And Father Christmas said that that's not the point. But battles are ugly when women fight. And then he whips out a pot of tea, says Merry Christmas, and leaves. I have so many questions. One would think that battles, meaning killing, would be ugly no matter who's fighting. Also, it would have been enough to just say, "Child, you are 9 years old and should not be going near any battles of any kind." But let's not dwell too long on Santa's casual sexism. His appearance meant something more than just gifts, as for many years Narnia had been in winter without ever having Christmas. So this marked the beginning of the end of the long winter. Chapter 5: Meeting Aslan. Back at the White Witch's castle, she sent her wolves ahead to the Beavers' house with the intention of killing whoever they found there, or track them if they had already left. She and Edmund then went off in her sledge, and they had to take a longer route as they were driving. Edmund was quite miserable by now. The witch wasn't anywhere near as nice as she had been the last time he was there, and there was no Turkish delight. Eventually, they came across a number of forest creatures who were gathered around a table, happily eating and drinking. However, their joy diminished the moment they saw the White Witch. She demanded to know what this celebration was, and they nervously replied that Father Christmas had given it to them. Furious, the White Witch raised her wand, and Edmund tried to stop her, but it was no use. She turned the whole group, including their table and food, into stone. And then she slapped Edmund across the face for trying to intervene. So Edmund was not feeling too happy now about the side he had chosen. As for his siblings, they continued walking with the Beavers, and as the hours went by, the season changed from winter to spring. The snow disappeared and the flowers bloomed, and eventually they reached a large open space on a hill where you could see all the way to the ocean. This hilltop was a place called the Stone Table, and it also had a stone table, just putting that out there. And next to it, many creatures had gathered in a half circle around a great lion, meaning Aslan himself. Aslan welcomed them and asked where the fourth sibling was, as the prophecy expected 4 humans. They revealed that Edmund had joined the White Witch, and Peter even took the blame for this, as he felt bad about how he had been treating his brother. Aslan then went off with Peter and showed him Cair Paravel in the distance, meaning the castle with the 4 thrones, explaining that Peter and his siblings were to become kings and queens of Narnia. Their conversation was cut short, however, as they were interrupted by the sound of Susan's horn. Peter rushed back and found that the animals had scattered, and Susan had been chased up into a tree by a big wolf. Peter rushed forward as the wolf kept snapping to get at Susan, and with his new sword, he managed to kill it, thus saving his sister. Aslan then ordered his centaurs and eagles to follow the other wolf that had come as it was running away, and thereby get Edmund back from the White Witch. Chapter 6: The Bargain. Meanwhile, Edmund was in a dark part of the forest with the White Witch and her dwarf. They had long since abandoned her sledge, as there was no snow left. Then a wolf appeared, reporting that his captain had been killed by the humans, and that they were all with Aslan. The witch then sent the wolf off to gather her own force, consisting of giants, werewolves, ghouls, and minotaurs. The list went on. Then they tied Edmund to a tree, although he wasn't really in any shape to go anywhere at this point. And it seemed as though they were just about to kill him when the search party sent by Aslan appeared. Using her magic, the witch put a charm on herself and her dwarf to make them look like a boulder and a stump. So when the search party arrived, they only saw Edmund there, tied to the tree. So they freed him and brought him with them back to Aslan's encampment. It was late in the night by now, and when Lucy, Susan, and Peter woke up in the encampment the next morning, they found their brother Edmund outside, walking and talking with Aslan. When they approached them, Aslan said that the past was in the past, to which they all agreed, and they all shook hands as Edmund apologized to them. So all was well and good, except that it wasn't. Not quite. Soon enough, the witch asked Aslan for an audience, which was held in front of everyone. Here she pointed out that Edmund was a traitor. He had betrayed his siblings, and all traitors were hers to kill, as the old laws said. There was magic in this law, and if she wasn't given the traitor's blood that was owed her, all of Narnia would perish in fire and water. So Aslan then went off to talk things over with her privately. And when they returned, Aslan told them all that she had renounced her claim on Edmund's blood, which was a relief to everyone. However, as the witch left them, Aslan said that they now had to move their encampment as the location will be used for other purposes. So, the whole encampment was then moved to another spot by a river, and Aslan was giving the children some troubling vibes. He seemed low and in deep contemplation about something. He also gave Peter way too many battle strategies for the poor boy to remember without a notebook. So that was also strange. That night, Susan and Lucy couldn't sleep, and they went outside just as Aslan walked slowly into the forest. They followed him, and he allowed them to keep him company under the condition that they stop when he told them to. So they walked on in silence, the two girls having one hand each in his mane, until he ordered them to stop and hide. They obeyed, but from their hiding place, they watched Aslan approach the White Witch and her followers that were gathered around the stone table. There they proceeded to tie him up, muzzle him, cut off his mane, and pull him onto the stone table. The witch then approached him with her knife, taunting him, saying that he had given his own life to save Edmund's. But who's to stop her from killing him as well as soon as Aslan's gone? Narnia will now be hers forever, and there is nothing he can do about it. The two girls put their hands over their faces in horror as the witch proceeded with her execution. Her followers of monstrous creatures roared with excitement as she pronounced him dead, and she ordered them all to march. This war would be a piece of cake now that the lion was dead. And off they all went, passing poor Lucy and Susan where they were hiding. And once the place was empty, they crawled out to Aslan's body. The girls cried and stayed with him all the way until dawn, and as the light began to appear in the east, dawn was then upon them, and Lucy and Susan walked to the edge of the hill, watching the castle of Cair Paravel in the distance. At that moment, a loud crack was heard, and they turned around to find the stone table broken in two. And not only that, Aslan was alive again. He appeared before them, larger and more lively than before, and he explained to them that there was an even older magic that the witch didn't know about. And that magical law said that if someone willingly sacrifices themselves instead of a traitor, then the stone table will break and death will be reversed. That is quite the coincidence, isn't it? He then jumped about in the grass for a bit with the girls. You know, as you do when you've just come back to life. And then he urged them to go on his back, and he charged ahead, faster than the fastest of horses, through forests and rivers, until they reached Cair Paravel and the courtyard of statues. Chapter 7. Once a king or queen in Narnia. Aslan went to work immediately, going from statue to statue and breathing on them, causing the spell to slowly wash away. As all the creatures of the courtyard were restored, they all entered the witch's castle, and Aslan restored every prisoner or otherwise unlucky soul to have been turned to stone in there, including Mr. Tumnus. How Lucy was relieved to see her dear friend Mr. Tumnus again, and thankfully he didn't seem at all for the worse for having spent some time being a statue. Then Aslan gathered the whole crowd of statues. No, that would have been something, wouldn't it? Then Aslan gathered the whole crowd of creatures and marched them all off towards the battle. They had no time to lose. When they arrived, Lucy saw the dreadful battlefield, and the witch seemed to have the upper hand. She had turned many on their side into statues, and now she was fighting Peter with her knife. One could question how an untrained 12-year-old boy could hold his own against an immortal witch queen with superhuman strength, but let's not. Aslan charged at the witch, and the reinforcements he had brought followed, turning the battle in their favor. The witch was swiftly defeated, it was over in minutes, and the good creatures of Narnia were victorious. Peter then told them that it was because of Edmund that they had even lasted that long. The witch was turning everyone to stone left and right, but Edmund fought his way through 3 ogres until he had reached the witch. And then he had aimed for her wand rather than her herself, which led him to getting gravely wounded, but had also ended up saving the rest from being turned to stone. They all went to see Edmund as he was being tended to by Mrs. Beaver, but he was covered in blood. It did not look good. Lucy then took the magic flower juice that was given to her by Father Christmas and poured a couple of drops in Edmund's mouth. She then went on to give drops to all of the wounded as Aslan continued the work of destoning the creatures. Once they were done, Edmund was not only fully restored, but he was his old self again, from back before he had even turned snarky and selfish, apparently. And then at about 8 o'clock, they all sat down to have high tea on the battlefield. Within the next day or two, Peter, Edmund, Susie, and Lucien... What? What did I just say? Within the next day or two, Peter, Edmund, Susan, and Lucy were sitting on the 4 thrones of Cair Paravel, officially crowned kings and queens of Narnia. And the whole realm rejoiced at the fulfillment of the prophecy. While their reign was long and happy and prosperous, we do not see any of it in this part of the story. For now, we flash forward many years when the 4 siblings, now adults, were riding through the western forest. Peter was now a tall, deep-chested warrior. Susan was gracious and beautiful, with many a king from neighboring countries asking for her hand in marriage. Edmund was more of the quiet type, but wise in counsel and judgment, and meanwhile Lucy was as happy and valiant as ever. At this point, they hardly even remembered their life back in the real world, as it was as if it had been just a dream of sorts. So there they were one day in the western forest, on the hunt for the white stag that was said to grant you wishes if you caught him. They followed the stag into the thickest parts of the forest, where they were forced to dismount. And after a while they came upon a peculiar sight. As Susan exclaimed, "There was a tree of iron," and Edmund concurred, saying it even had a lantern on it. What a strange device. They recollected that they might have seen a device like this before, somewhere. Susan urged them to return to their horses, but the others wanted to explore a bit further. And so it was that the 4 siblings went further into the thicket, and soon enough, the trees turned into soft coats, and out the wardrobe door they went. Once more as children, and in the same clothes that they had worn the day they left. They still had their memories, however, and immediately rushed off to the professor to explain why 4 coats were missing from the wardrobe. And contrary to what they had expected, the professor wasn't dismissive at all of their story about Narnia. On the contrary, he advised them not to seek a way back to Narnia on their own, but rather they will come back there again when the time is right. And that's the end of this story, but nowhere near the end of the adventures of Narnia. And if you haven't guessed it already, the old man professor is none other than Diggory, the protagonist from the first book. It is rather ambiguous in this one, since The Magician's Nephew was written after The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And I tell you, when I realized his identity as a child, my mind was properly blown. It's quite precious when you think back on it. Anyway. Chapter 8, My Thoughts. Let me just get one thing off my chest. There's something about this story that rubs me the wrong way. And no, it has nothing to do with the religious connotations. It just feels kind of sloppy. Like there are rules and law and other details that seem quite unplanned and haphazardly put together. Kind of if you were to tell a story to a child and you're just making things up as you go. My biggest issue, to make my point, is that of the deep magic, where the White Witch talks of some emperor that wrote the rule that all traitors were hers to kill. That's all we know about the so-called deep magic rules, apparently. But no, then we have the magic before dawn of time rules, where Aslan says that a willing sacrifice instead of a traitor will reverse death, which just so happens to be a plot point of the story. Do you see what I mean? No other rules are explained, which makes it a little frustrating. It's like a prime example of the whole "a wizard did it" trope. I would have loved to know why the emperor, whoever he was, made that rule in the first place. I simply cannot imagine it being King Frank, the first king of Narnia, as we see in The Magician's Nephew. And when C.S. Lewis wrote that one, which is a prequel to this book, he gave us more of a backstory to the lamppost in the forest. And don't get me wrong, I love that lamppost, but I feel like some of the other stuff remains unexplained. Unless it's brought up again in one of the Caspian books, because they are the ones I remember the least. I guess we'll see. So, some likes and dislikes. Number 1, the magical wardrobe is such a wonderful, mysterious concept that I adored as a child. And rereading it now, as an adult, wow, the binding really does not sound great. Anyway, rereading it now as an adult, I could still feel a tingle of excitement as Lucy discovered the portal for the first time. So that still holds up in my opinion. Number 2, I really liked the character growth of Edmund. I thought that was quite nice. He's the one that feels the most human out of all of the characters, in my opinion. The only disappointing thing is that his redemption happens off the page and is told to us afterwards. I don't really understand that at all. The book already switches between Edmund and Lucy several times, so it's not a POV issue. But for some reason, him literally destroying the witch's wand and getting wounded in the process wasn't deemed worthy of page time compared to Lucy gallivanting around the country with Aslan. And number 3 is also kind of a mixed bag. I liked seeing the witch, Queen Jadis, being consistent in her character, even if she is still quite one-dimensional. There were a few callbacks in her manipulation of Edmund, if you compare it to how she tried to manipulate Diggory in the first book. The thing that bothers me here, though, is that of the magical apple tree that was supposed to keep her out of Narnia. Since the prequel was written after this one, I can't help but wonder why this was put in there. I mean, I suppose you could come to the conclusion that Jadis made it always winter so that the magical tree couldn't bear any fruit. But when Aslan came, she wasn't really bothered by it not being winter anymore. So that theory kind of falls flat. Let me know if you have any other theories on that. I am all ears. As you've noticed, my likes and dislikes were sort of merged in this one. It really isn't my favorite entry in the series, not even in the top 3 actually, but it's still a cozy read. Now, I'd like to know what you all think of this book. or the video, leave any and all of your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next installment of the series, which is one of my favorites, The Horse and His Boy. I'm really looking forward to this one. Okay, back for a quick appearance. Niles and I thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you back next time.